What if one of the oldest cities in the Americas is not telling the story we were taught? Near Lima, Peru, on the western coast of South America, archaeologists uncovered a civilization about 5,000 years old, so organized, and so unexpected that it still challenges the way we explain the beginning of civilization. Caral-Supe, a city of pyramids, plazas, instruments, ceremonial spaces, and monumental planning. A city built before pottery, before metal, before the standard story of civilization knows what to do with it. And yet, it stands. Stay with me until the end of this video, because you are about to see an ancient standing stone from Caral-Supe that, to the best of our knowledge, has not been publicly identified in this way anywhere in the world before this investigation. We are presenting that identification here for the first time. For years, the world has been told that Caral-Supe was one of the first great urban experiments in the Americas, a civilization rising in isolation. But what if isolation is the wrong word? What if Caral preserves not only an ancient city, but an ancient memory? Because the deeper we look, the stranger the clues become. A pre-pottery civilization that already challenges the standard ladder of progress. A ceremonial world shaped by sound, stone, and public order. Objects that raise questions beyond the local landscape. And at the center of it all, a sacred form in stone that may change the way this site must be seen. This is not a story of fantasy. It is a story of stone, sound, symbol, and survival. And once you see what Caral may have preserved, it may never look the same again.
For more than 30 years, I have traveled across more than 25 countries as an independent researcher, trying to understand one question: what truly happened in the ancient world? Again and again, I found myself drawn not only to monuments and archaeology, but to memory, to literature, to symbols, to the ways civilizations preserve truth when formal history fails. In this series, I have been following clues that point to a larger ancient pattern, one in which sacred symbolism, dynastic memory, and civilizational movement may have reached far beyond the maps we inherited. We have already followed parts of that pattern through Mesoamerica and the Andes, but in this video, we go deeper in time to Caral-Supe. When I first planned my visit to Caral-Supe in Peru, I did not go there looking for the extraordinary identification you will see by the end of this video. I went because Caral was already extraordinary, a city older than expected, a pre-pottery civilization of monumental scale, a place that should already force us to rethink how civilization begins. But once I stood there and examined what the site preserved, I began to see something I could not ignore. Not one isolated resemblance, not convenient storytelling, a pattern. Before we go further, we must address one of the strongest assumptions modern viewers carry with them, that ancient long-distance contact across oceans must have been impossible. That is why the next section matters, because if the sea was never the impossible barrier we were taught to imagine, then Caral-Supe can no longer be dismissed simply because Peru is far from India. We have to look at the evidence itself. But before we begin that journey, I want to introduce one old Tamil poetic line that stayed with me for years. It comes from Purapporul Venba Malai in the section known as Karanthai Padalam. The work is generally placed around the early medieval period, roughly around 800 AD. The Tamil line says, Kal tondri, man tondra kalate, valodu mun tondriya mootha kudi. Even before translation, the line carries the rhythm of something meant to be remembered. In simple translation, it means after stone appeared and before mud appeared, an ancient lineage had already appeared with the sword. Let me say that more simply. After stone, before mud, an ancient lineage with the sword. For years, I did not know what to do with that line. It sounded mythical, too old, too poetic, too difficult to place in real history. But by the end of this video, let us return to this line and ask a different question. Does it still sound like myth, or does it begin to feel like memory? Let us begin.
True history is not a luxury. It is a fundamental right, and it belongs to everyone. Best Kept Secrets is a 6-volume journey in pursuit of a clearer, deeper understanding of human civilization, beyond inherited timelines, beyond imposed limits, and beyond the maps we were given. It is guided by evidence, context, memory, and the courage to look again. Volume 1 is ready. Volumes 2 and 3 are now in their final stages, and the journey continues. History should speak your language. We are translating this series and narrating these videos across many languages of the world. If your language is missing, let us know in the comments. Together, let us move closer to true history, little by little. This is Best Kept Secrets. And this is where the story begins.
Before we enter Caral-Supe, we need to face one question directly, because many viewers will ask it. How could ancient people have crossed seas that modern people imagine were impossible barriers? It is a fair question. If we cannot answer that question clearly, then everything that follows will feel difficult to consider. So let us separate 3 things. What archaeology already accepts, what most of us were taught, and what this investigation is asking us to reconsider. Most of us were taught history as if the oceans became important only a few centuries ago, when European ships crossed them, recorded them, and claimed them. That does not mean every textbook was deliberately wrong. It means the story most of us received was compressed. It focused on the recent, well-documented age of empire, but it did not give us the deeper archaeological background needed to understand how old the human relationship with the sea really is. But that is not the beginning of the human relationship with the sea. That is only one recent, well-documented imperial chapter. The human sea story is much older. Many people assume that ancient movement between distant lands would only make sense if continents were once connected by land. But that belongs to geological time, not human time. Yes, continents move, but the great separations of the continents happened tens to hundreds of millions of years before human civilization. By the time Homo sapiens entered the story, the oceans were already real. The distances were real, the water barriers were real, and human beings crossed them anyway. This is not a claim invented for this series. This is established archaeology. Take Sahul. Sahul is the name archaeologists use for the Ice Age landmass that included Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, when sea levels were lower than today. But even then, Sahul was not simply connected to mainland Asia by dry land. To reach it, people had to move through island Southeast Asia, across a broken world of islands, straits, currents, and open water. And according to established archaeological research, human beings were already in northern Australia by about 65,000 years ago. That fact alone should change how we imagine ancient human possibility. One accidental drift may explain one lost person. It does not explain a lasting human population. To settle a new land, enough people had to arrive to survive, reproduce, adapt, and carry memory forward. That means we are not looking only at one lucky raft. We are looking at maritime capability strong enough to change the human map. And Sahul is not the only clue. Look at island Southeast Asia. This is the island world between mainland Asia and Australia. It includes places such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Timor, New Guinea, and many smaller islands between them. These islands matter because many of them could not simply be reached by walking. Even when sea levels were lower, water still stood between important land masses. Now look at Flores. Flores is an island in Indonesia. Archaeologists there discovered the remains of a small-bodied ancient human species called Homo floresiensis. Because of its short stature, the world came to know it by a simpler nickname, the Hobbit. The fossils date roughly between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, and stone tools from the same island context reach even further back. So before we even speak about later sailors, kingdoms, or civilizations, one fact is already clear. Island worlds were not beyond human reach. For this investigation, the important point is simple. Flores was an island separated by deep water barriers. So the presence of ancient humans or human relatives there reminds us that island movement in deep prehistory was real. Now look at Luzon. Luzon is a major island in the Philippines. At Calao Cave on Luzon, archaeologists found ancient human remains dated to about 67,000 years ago. Again, the point is not complicated. Luzon was not a place people could simply walk to from mainland Asia. Its early human presence points again to ancient movement through an island world. Now look at Timor. Timor is an island in the chain between Indonesia and Australia. Today, the island is divided between Indonesian territory and the country of Timor-Leste, also known as East Timor. At Ceremonial, a rock shelter in East Timor, archaeologists found fish remains dating to about 42,000 years ago. Some of those fish were pelagic fish. That means fish that live in deeper, open waters, not just in shallow water beside the beach. This matters because catching such fish is not the same as picking up shellfish near the shore. It requires people to go farther into the water. It requires equipment. It requires timing. It requires repeated experience with the sea. So this is not only evidence that people crossed water, it is evidence that people were learning how to use the sea as a working environment. They were learning where to go, when to go, what to catch, and how to return. That is a very different level of maritime knowledge. Now move farther east toward New Guinea and the islands beyond it. This region is often called Near Oceania. For ordinary viewers, think of it this way. Near Oceania is the island zone east of New Guinea, including the Bismarck Archipelago and nearby islands in Papua New Guinea. By the late Pleistocene, around the 20,000-year range, archaeology shows something very important there. People were not only reaching islands, they were moving resources between islands. One of those resources was obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It was valuable because it could be shaped into very sharp tools. If obsidian from one island is found on another island, that tells us something important. The stone did not move by itself. People moved it. They had to know where the source was. They had to know how to reach it. They had to bring it back or carry it onward. That is not just survival. That is remembered movement. That is repeated movement. That is the beginning of root knowledge. The same logic applies to animals. In this same broad island world, evidence suggests that people transported useful animals such as the northern common cuscus. A cuscus is a small tree-living animal from the region. It is a marsupial, which means it carries its young in a pouch, like a kangaroo or a possum. Why does this matter? Because moving a living animal across water is not the same as drifting across the sea. A living animal needs to be controlled. It may need food, it may need water, it has to be kept alive until the journey ends. So the people carrying it were not only trying to survive the trip, they were thinking about the place they were going. They were thinking about what would be useful after arrival. That is planning. That is maritime logistics in simple human terms. It means the vessel was not only a way to escape danger, it was a way to move life, tools, food sources, and future possibilities from one island to another. This is where the modern imagination often fails us. We picture ancient sea travel as if people needed engines, steel ships, GPS screens, and modern maps. They did not. They needed seaworthy craft. They needed workable propulsion. They needed memory. They needed timing. They needed to understand winds, currents, seasons, birds, clouds, waves, reefs, and landfall. To an untrained person, the sea may look empty. But to a trained maritime culture, the sea contains information. Birds can point toward land. Clouds can show where islands may be. Waves can change when they meet reefs or distant shores. Currents can carry signs from places beyond the horizon. The ancient sea was not empty to those who knew how to read it. It was a living map. And once a community learns that winds move one way in one season and another way in another season, the ocean changes character. It becomes a seasonal bridge. Now, let me be very clear about what I am saying and what I am not saying. I am not saying that global trade networks existed 65,000 years ago. I am not saying that this proves every later contact. It does not. But it does prove something important. Humans were learning the sea far earlier than the modern imagination usually allows. I am not saying that the people who reached Sahul built Caral-Supe. That is not the argument here. The point is more basic, and it is already powerful. Established archaeology shows that human beings crossed water, settled island worlds, caught deeper water fish, moved stone between islands, transported useful animals, and learned to read the ocean not merely a few centuries ago, but tens of thousands of years before the modern age of recorded imperial navigation. We did not invent those facts for this series. They are real archaeological evidence. What this series is asking is different. If maritime capability was already part of the human story as early as the Sahul movement, around 65,000 years ago, then we should stop treating the ocean as an automatic objection. We should stop saying, that could not have happened because there was water in the way. The better question is this: when did sea crossing become route memory? And when did route memory become civilizational strategy? And once we ask that question, the later civilizational record becomes important. I am not saying that the Sahul movement was global trade. It was not. But if we look across the last 10,000 years of human civilizational history, the evidence becomes more concrete. Coastal movement, maritime exchange, ports, trade routes, and state-sponsored expeditions begin to appear more clearly in the record. In Volume 1 of Best Kept Secrets, and in other videos on this channel, I have discussed that later maritime world in more detail, from Lothal in the Indus world, with its important maritime infrastructure, to Egypt's state-run expeditions to Punt. Those examples belong to a much later chapter than Sahul, but they show the direction of the human story. Water crossing became route memory, and route memory became civilizational strategy. That is why this matters before we enter Caral-Supe. Because if ancient people were capable of serious maritime movement far earlier than our school books trained us to imagine, then we cannot dismiss distant symbols, strange artifacts, and unexpected sacred forms simply because an ocean stands between them. The sea was not waiting for modern engines to become meaningful. It had already become a road. And once that road is restored to the story, Caral-Supe begins to look very different. Caral-Supe is not a minor site. It is one of the oldest known urban centers in the Americas. Its major phase belongs to a world more than 4,500 years old. This means Caral existed long before many later civilizations that people usually associate with ancient grandeur. And what emerged there was not a rough village slowly moving toward complexity. It was a planned civilization. It had monumental pyramidal architecture. It had formal plazas. It had organized public spaces. It had ceremonial order. It was a city already thinking at scale. And just as important, it does not appear to have been organized around war. Archaeologists have not found the usual signs of weapons, defensive walls, or violent destruction. That makes Caral even more unusual. It was monumental. It was organized. But it does not look like a city built around conquest. And it did this before pottery became part of its known material culture. Before metal, before the simple ladder of civilization feels ready for it. That is why Caral mattered even before this investigation began. It already asked a difficult question. How did such an organized civilization appear so early? And this is where the old Tamil line began to return with new force. After stone appeared, and before mud appeared, an ancient lineage had already appeared with the sword. For years, I had held that line as myth, or at best as a poetic memory too old to trust literally. But Caral-Supe changed the way that line sounded. Here was a real civilization. Before pottery, before metal, monumental, ordered, already functioning at scale. That does not prove the Tamil line by itself, but it makes the line harder to dismiss, because Caral gives us a real archaeological world that fits the broad civilizational phase I hear in the line. After stone, before mud or pottery, already organized, already civilizational. The site was brought to world attention through the pioneering work of Dr. Ruth Shady, the Peruvian archaeologist and anthropologist who led the Caral-Supe investigations, and her team. Its importance is not in doubt. The question is whether the frame around Caral has been large enough. Because Caral does not sit comfortably inside the old idea of a pristine beginning sealed off from the wider ancient world. It looks too deliberate, too organized, too symbolically alive. And once we follow what it preserves, that old description becomes even harder to sustain. Caral was not silent. That is important. Among the discoveries from Caral are instruments and ceremonial sound objects. These show that sound was part of public and sacred life at the site. For an ordinary viewer, this may sound like a small detail, but it is not. Music in an ancient city is not only entertainment, it can organize people, it can guide ritual, it can mark time, it can bring a community into shared action. A civilization that organizes sound is organizing human behavior. That means Caral was not only building with stone, it was also shaping experience. It was using sound, space, and ceremony together. This is why the acoustic dimension of Caral matters. When a society understands how sound behaves in space, it is not simply making noise. It is controlling atmosphere. It is guiding attention. It is giving ritual a physical setting. Stone, sound, movement, and gathering begin to work together. One object at Caral-Supe especially reminded me of the musical stone tradition of South India, where stone pillars in temples were shaped to produce sound. I am not saying this comparison proves everything by itself, but when a pre-pottery city brings together stone, public space, ceremonial sound, and musical objects, the comparison deserves attention. That connection reminded me of the classical Tami-Thinai tradition, where landscape, human life, music, emotion, and social order were understood together, not as separate categories, but as one civilizational grammar. To me, this looks like one of humanity's early attempts to organize sound in stone, not as decoration, but as part of sacred and civic life. That is not primitive. That is civilizational. A city that can organize public space, ceremonial sound, and monumental architecture is already far beyond the image of a simple early settlement. Caral was not standing at the edge of civilization. It was already inside one of civilization's early mature expressions. And now, before we examine the deeper clues, we need to understand two sacred forms. First, Om, then Vinayaka. Without those two keys, the standing stone at Caral cannot be read properly. Around the world today, millions of people have seen the symbol known as Om on temple walls, in yoga studios, on pendants, in meditation spaces, in books, posters, and spiritual imagery. It is one of the most recognized sacred symbols on Earth. But many people recognize it only at the surface. They know the shape. They may know it is sacred, but they may not know what it means. So before we go further, here is the simplest way to understand Om. Om is a sacred sound in Indian tradition. It is treated as a deep vibration connected to existence itself. In Indian tradition, Om is also known as a Beja mantra. Beja means seed, so this is not treated as an ordinary sound. It is treated as a seed sound, a compact sacred vibration carrying a larger spiritual meaning. Like a seed, it is understood to contain a larger spiritual structure within a small sound. But Om is not understood as only one sound. It is also understood as three sound values joined together. A, U, M. These three sound values are traditionally connected with the cycle of existence, creation, preservation, and dissolution. In simple terms, the beginning, the sustaining, and the returning of all things. But Om is not only heard, it is also seen. At some point, this sacred sound was given a visual form. That visual form became the symbol many people recognize today. A curve, an arc, a turning shape, a sacred sound made visible. In Indian spiritual understanding, that visual form is not arbitrary. If you look at the way Om is written in Tamil, its shape can be read as reflecting the inner path of Kundalini, the rising movement of energy from the Muladhara, at the base of the spine, upward toward the Agnya center between the eyebrows. In simple terms, Om is not only a sound, it is also a sacred visual map of inner ascent. That visual shape matters in this video, so remember it. Not as decoration, not as a random symbol, but as a sacred form with structure. Because when we return to Caral, that structure becomes important. Now consider another sacred figure known across much of the world, Vinayaka. Many people know him by his more familiar Sanskrit name, Ganesha. For viewers who are not familiar with Indian tradition, Vinayaka is the elephant-headed sacred figure often remembered at the beginning of important undertakings. He is widely known as the remover of obstacles, a guardian of beginnings, a sacred presence invoked before a new journey begins. That is the familiar devotional layer, and it matters. But it is not the whole story, because the form of Vinayaka also carries deeper symbolic meaning. The elephant head, the trunk, the direction of the trunk, the curve of the form. These are not only artistic details, they can carry sacred meaning. And one of the least understood connections is this. Vinayaka and Om are linked, not loosely, not only emotionally, but visually and philosophically. Look at the visual form of Om, its curve, its arc, its turning extension. Now look at Vinayaka, the head, the trunk, the directional curve. The same kind of sacred visual language begins to appear. This does not mean every elephant-headed image is automatically the same thing. That would be too simple. The specific form matters. In this investigation, the important form is Valampuri Vinayaka. Valampuri means the trunk turns to the right. That right-turning form is considered more exact, more disciplined, and more symbolically charged in the tradition. So when we later look at the standing stone in Caral, the question is not, does this roughly look like an elephant? The question is much more specific. Does the form preserve the disciplined visual structure of Valampuri Vinayaka? And does that form also preserve the deeper visual relationship with Om? That is why this section matters. We are not preparing for a loose resemblance. We are preparing for a specific comparison. Vinayaka is not only a beloved sacred figure, he is also a philosophical form, a sacred idea made visible. And once you understand that relationship between Om and Valampuri Vinayaka, Caral begins to speak differently. Now return to Caral-Supe, return to the city of sound, return to the ceremonial landscape, return to the ancient stones. Now we have 3 pieces of context. First, Caral is an ancient pre-pottery civilization. Second, Caral preserves a ceremonial and musical world. Third, Om and Valampuri Vinayaka are not random devotional symbols. They carry sacred visual structure. So when we look at Caral again, we are not looking for fantasy. We are asking a disciplined question. Did this ancient Peruvian site preserve a sacred form that later Indian tradition still knows how to read? That is the question. And inside Caral, the clues do not begin with the standing stone. They begin with the objects already found there, especially the flutes. Among the most remarkable objects from Caral are its flutes. These were not ordinary objects. They belonged to a ceremonial world where sound clearly mattered. Some of the visual forms on these flutes have been read in more than one way. Viewed one way, they may suggest one creature. Viewed another way, they may suggest another. And one of the most striking readings is elephant imagery. That matters because elephants are not native to Peru. They are not native to South America. They do not belong to the natural animal world of Caral-Supe. So when an elephant-like form appears in the sacred or ceremonial objects of Caral, it creates a serious question. Where did that form come from? The question cannot be answered inside the local animal world of Peru. Elephants were known in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, not in ancient South America. So when elephant imagery appears in a sacred or ceremonial setting here, it points beyond the local landscape. It points to memory. It points to movement. It points to a wider cultural world than the isolation model allows. This is why the flute evidence matters. By itself, it does not answer everything, but it creates a problem for the old frame. Because when a South American site preserves imagery that points toward an animal foreign to South America, we should not ignore it. We should examine it carefully. And then came the stone. During our visit to Caral-Supe, one standing stone drew attention. It was not the reason we went to Caral. It was not something we arrived determined to find. In fact, it was my wife who first noticed it and asked me to look more closely. That detail matters, because this was not a conclusion forced onto the site before we arrived. It began with field observation. A stone, a shape, a question. At first, it was simply unusual, a rough ancient form in a site already filled with unanswered questions. But the more closely it was examined, the harder it became to ignore what it preserved. First, look at the profile. Look at the head-like form. Look at the descending curve. Look at the direction of the turn. Now compare that to the form we discussed earlier, Valampuri Vinayaka, the right-turning form. This is the best-kept secrets identification. To the best of our knowledge, this specific identification has not been publicly documented anywhere in the world before the best-kept secrets investigation. We are presenting it here for the first time. The significance does not end with Vinayaka, because Valampuri Vinayaka itself carries a deeper relationship with the Beja mantra Om, the sacred seed sound we introduced earlier. So now look again. The curve, the turn, the sacred geometry. Not in India, not in Southeast Asia, but in Caral-Supe, Peru, in stone, in one of the oldest known urban civilizations of the ancient Americas, more than 4,600 years old. This is why the moment matters. The site itself is real. Its antiquity is real. Its importance is already established by archaeology. The identification we are presenting is the new part, and that identification deserves to be examined carefully. With this reading, a sacred philosophical form deeply associated with Tamil and Indian knowledge appears in one of the oldest known urban centers of the ancient Americas. Not as a late borrowing, not as a medieval transfer, but inside an early civilizational landscape already ancient when much of the later world had not yet emerged. This is where the Caral-Supe finding begins to touch the larger best-kept secrets investigation. In my wider work, I have been tracing a much larger dynastic pattern across the ancient Americas, one in which the Andean world repeatedly opens toward Chola memory, while Mesoamerica opens toward the Pandya world. This video is not the place to unfold that entire pattern, but if a Valampuri Vinayaka form truly appears at Caral-Supe, then Caral can no longer be treated as a small, isolated curiosity. It becomes part of a much larger question. Did the Americas preserve fragments of Indian dynastic and sacred memory far more deeply than our inherited maps allow? This does not ask for blind belief. It asks for something harder. To look again, to test carefully, and to consider whether the categories we inherited are too narrow for what this stone preserves. The old line, after stone, before mud, an ancient lineage with the sword, no longer feels the same. At the beginning, it may have sounded like myth. Now it begins to sound like memory. Not because one clue alone proves everything. That is not the argument. The argument is that several clues are now pointing in the same direction. First, Caral-Supe is a real pre-pottery civilization. It is monumental, organized, ceremonial, and far older than many viewers expect. Second, the modern objection that oceans made ancient movement impossible is not supported by the deeper archaeological record. Ancient humans crossed water, settled island worlds, worked deeper seas, and moved resources across islands long before modern empires began recording ocean routes. Third, Caral preserves a ceremonial world of sound. That matters because sound, ritual, and public order are not minor details. They are marks of organized civilization. Fourth, the flute imagery creates a serious question. Why does a South American site preserve forms that appear to point toward elephant memory when elephants are not native to South America? Fifth, the standing stone adds an even sharper question. Why does this form align so closely with Valampuri Vinayaka and the symbolic structure of These clues do not sit comfortably inside a sealed local frame. They ask for a wider investigation. And the Vinayaka form stone is not the only sacred presence at Caral-Supe. A stag-related divine form, what I call the stag god, is also identifiable there. That means Caral may not preserve only one isolated sacred image. It may preserve a more complex sacred culture, a world with more than one sacred presence, more than one symbol, more than one divine memory. In simple terms, Caral may have preserved a polytheistic sacred world, a sacred universe with multiple divine forms, not just one. The stag god finding deserves its own careful investigation, and I will return to it in a future video. But even here, the larger picture begins to change. Caral-Supe no longer looks like a simple, isolated beginning. It looks like a remembered fragment of a larger world, a world of movement, a world of sacred memory, a world in which symbol, sound, and civilization may have traveled farther than the inherited map allows. And if that is true, then the question is no longer only whether Caral is ancient. Everyone already knows it is ancient. The deeper question is this: is our map of the ancient world too small? And if one ancient city in Peru can preserve such clues, what else might the old Tamil texts still remember? What if the next signs do not point only to Peru, but to the Pandya world itself, to a city we thought we knew, to a geography we may have placed on the wrong map? What if one of the greatest remembered centers of ancient Tamil civilization belongs not where we have been taught to place it, but somewhere else entirely? That journey is ahead, and once we get there, the map may shift again.
There is something even more important here. The memory is preserved in a Tamil poem, but the poem didn't name a city. It didn't give us a local map. It preserved something more unusual, a phase of human civilization, a world after stone, before mud, before pottery, already organized, already civilizational. That matters, because Caral-Supe may be one example of that wider ancient condition. Not the only place where such a memory could belong, not the only ancient world waiting to be read again, but one real archaeological example where the broad pattern becomes visible. That means this memory may not live only in one place. It may wait in other ancient worlds the modern world has not yet learned to read. To my knowledge, this is one of the clearest literary memories anywhere of a pre-pottery civilizational phase. And if other ancient traditions preserve similar clues, I welcome that evidence. That is why this matters so much to me. And it is also why this channel will continue to investigate more such worlds. You may also wonder whether Vinayaka forms have appeared anywhere else outside India. They have. Later examples are known across Asia, but those belong to a much later world. What stands in Caral-Supe, to the best of our knowledge, is older by millennia. That is not a small margin. What you have seen in this video is only part of the Caral-Supe investigation. There's much more this site preserves, more than any one video can hold. And there is another reason this investigation cannot end here. In my wider reading of Tamil literature, I believe the memory does not stop with the face. It may also preserve the name of the ancient city world behind Caral-Supe. That thread deserves its own careful investigation. and it is one of the reasons this series will return to Caral-Supe. This channel will continue to investigate other ancient worlds where this forgotten civilizational memory may resurface. This is a serious evidence-led effort to recover a deeper history of the ancient world. Subscribe to the channel and continue this investigation with us. Share this video with people who still believe the world map explains everything. Like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and help this work reach the audience it deserves. Because true history is not a luxury, it is a right. Continue the journey with us. I will meet you in the next video.